Welcome everyone to this Open Ireland Network community call. We haven't been around for a while, but we're back now with a series of webinars and meetings covering the topic of open source. And as some of you may know, but many of you may not, we are here as a community to try and promote the idea of open source in Ireland at a national level. And to do that, we want to bring in voices from the global community to hear what's happening abroad and what's happening regionally, and also to hear a lot about what's happening in Ireland in the open source community. So that's what we're here to do. And today we've got two great presentations. Well, we've got two great discussions, one presentation, one discussion, about two very important topics. So one is the trend of open source in Europe, and Colin will be sharing that in just 1 minute. And then we'll go on to the Cyber Resilience Act and the impact that that may have for everyone actually, but particularly for us here in Europe. So two very important topics that have, I suppose, been in the news of late that would be great to share with the community. Now, just before we start, I just want to share with people that this is being recorded. We will be cutting out the discussion part of the presentations or the discussions, because they'll be under Chatham House rule. So we do say that for when we do have audience participation, that is under Chatham House rule, and we will make sure to not include that in the recording after the fact. But we will share the presentations or any information that we think will be useful for the community after the fact. So without further ado, I want to say thank you again to our speakers and to those of you who could join us. And I will pass over to Colin to take us away with, first of all, the trends in open source in Europe. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks very much. I'm assuming you can see my screen now?
We can. It's looking great.
Yeah, for some reason it's got your faces over the top of the screen. I'm assuming you can see the screen without your faces.
Yes, that's just your viewing option.
Fantastic. Great. Okay, in that case, no more tech checks required. I'll get started. So yeah, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to be sharing some of the findings of a recent research project that we undertook in collaboration with the Linux Foundation research. Before we get onto that, just a little bit about myself. I'm Colin Eberhardt. I'm the CTO of an organization called ScottLogic, which you no doubt haven't heard of, so I thought I'd give you a very brief introduction. So we're a UK-based software consultancy based in a number of locations within the UK. We're around about 500 people, and we work predominantly within financial services and public sector organizations building bespoke software solutions. So the reason that we were asked to do this, and the reason that we were very interested in undertaking this project, is open source is a significant part of everything we do with all of our client organizations. We've been an active member of Linux Foundation and FINOS for a number of years. I'm also an avid personal contributor to open source as well. So that's why we were interested in engaging in this project. Now, open source, again, this audience probably knows this quite well, but I do want to sort of reiterate what is open source. So it's become something of a dominant force within the software industry. As software continues to wade into almost every other industry sector, open source software has followed. So the impact it has is incredibly broad across pretty much every sector that you can imagine. Although what I find quite interesting is that open source is or can be a little hard to define. It means different things to different people. For some, it's a way of working. Some, I guess, it's a way of life. For others, it's a business model, a cultural phenomenon. It's for some, it's the code. For some, it's community. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But I think the one thing that everyone can pretty much agree on is that open source is definitely ubiquitous. Depending on the surveys that you look at, anything between sort of 70% to 90% of software products are now open source. And by that I mean, if you, for example, we use Microsoft Teams at work. Microsoft Teams is built on top of React and Electron and a whole load of open source components, and then a 20% proprietary slice of code sat on top. So take-home message there is open source is everywhere. I'm probably preaching to the converted in that you probably know this all already. So the project itself, we were commissioned by Linux Foundation Research to write a report on the state of open source in Europe. And this is basically a repeat of an exercise we did last year. I guess the take-home message is they liked what we did last year. There was a team of folk from Scott Logic, and the Linux Foundation research team ran the survey. We then undertook a significant number of interviews. We interviewed about 15 different people, collected about 8 hours of audio from that, and then did the analysis and the write-up. And the report was published just a few weeks ago at Linux Foundation Summit Europe. It was great to see it featured as part of the keynote. We were really pleased to get that exposure, because we think the results in this report are not just interesting, they're results that people should be acting upon. So what I want to do is give you a bit of a flavor of the report. And as you can imagine, it's around about 50 pages long. It's got 30 charts. I can't go into all of the detail. What I'm going to do is give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour, pick out some of the highlights, pick out what I think are some of the most interesting findings, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions and also share your thoughts and feelings about the report as well. So one of the things that was really quite clear is that the value of open source is growing and the momentum is increasing. And we found this across a number of different survey questions. So in this one, for example, we asked about whether open source is valuable to the future of their industry, and 89% of the respondents indicated that yes, it is valuable to the future of their industry, and 68% strongly agreed. Now, notably, 72% of the respondents work in sectors other than information technology. So this isn't just IT folks saying, yeah, open source is important. This is people across a wide range of industry sectors. And again, to echo, open source makes up a significant portion of almost all software that makes its way into production in the world at the moment. But the value is not just remaining static. The value is perceived to be growing as well. So we asked about the change in the value your organization derives from open source compared to last year. And as you can see, there's a quite a positive sentiment expressed towards a growing value in open source. And I guess taking a step back and asking yourselves, why might this be the case? I think most of us can agree that open source is at the forefront of most technology innovation. If you look at some of the biggest innovations that are underway at the moment, cloud, for example, a significant amount of cloud technology is open source through Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Kubernetes. There's a very long list of important cloud technology that's entirely open source. AI is another area where there's a lot of technology innovation, and there's a long list of open source technologies there: TensorFlow, PyTorch, Hugging Face, some of the new models like Llama, for example. And then if you look at some of the things that are now conventional and everyday, for example, the World Wide Web, almost everything relating to the World Wide Web is open source. You'd actually be hard pushed to find something proprietary and closed source in the web. So it's no wonder that people see a significant value in open source and a growth in value when they associate it with technology innovation. So we also asked the value that organizations derive. What are the benefits they derive from open source? As I mentioned earlier, people have a different perspective on what open source is. So it's an interesting question to ask. And at the top, we can see that people often benefit from lower cost of ownership, improved productivity, less vendor lock-in. So lower cost of ownership, quite simply, a lot of open source is free. Now, the two do not necessarily go hand in hand, but there is a significant amount of technology innovation you can access without having to pay any fees. One of the things I find quite interesting here is if we look at the very bottom, improved security. Organizations are less eagerly expressing that they get improved security by adopting open source software. And this is quite interesting. You may have heard of a law called Linus law from Linus Torvalds, where given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. That's a law that I think people no longer consider to be a truism, and there are certainly question marks about the security of open source software, and that's something we'll delve into in a little bit more detail later on. We also asked about the open source technologies organizations are using, and I'm not going to go into all the details here, but if we just look at the very top, Linux, it's a pervasive operating system, but as you'd expect, cloud, container technologies, CI/CD, DevOps, these are some of the most often used open source technologies by organizations. But you'll see I've outlined just one technology here: artificial intelligence and machine learning. In terms of open source usage, it's pretty much mid-table. But then another question we asked is, which open source technologies do you consider to be important to the future of the organization that you work within? And whilst most of the items in the table remain in their current position, artificial intelligence has risen almost entirely to the top. What we're seeing is a real groundswell in open source artificial intelligence and a desire across many organizations to reap the rewards, to benefit from this. And one thing I want to point out is this is not a new phenomenon. It's easy to sort of equate this to generative AI, ChatGPT. This is a shift. This is a change that's been happening for a number of years. There's an OECD report that tracks various open source projects, and they've found that AI is growing significantly faster than many other open source technologies. However, it's not all positive, as you can imagine. There are some challenges that our research highlighted, and one of the ones I want to highlight is the gap between open source use and contribution. So just to briefly explain what we mean by these terms, use is when you download an open source tool or component and incorporate it into your product, or you use it to help you build the product. So for example, CI/CD tools or languages like Python, which are open source, or TypeScript, which are open source. That is usage of an open source component. Contribution is quite simply when you give back to open source, when you add value back to the open source community through often code, but it can be other activities as well. It can be other community-based activities. Personally, I like this sort of quite simplistic view of there are open source makers and there are open source takers, and some people can people and organizations can obviously occupy both sides. Now this diagram shows the imbalance and the asymmetry. Now it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to quickly explain it. So on the horizontal axis, this is the contribution policy that people are aware of at their organization, with on the left-hand side, non-permissive. So open source contributions are not permitted, whereas on the right-hand side, open source contributions are openly encouraged. So what you see here is a spectrum of a level of permissiveness with respect to their open source contribution policy. On the vertical axis, it's exactly the same thing for open source usage. At the bottom, use of open source is not permitted, and at the top, use of open source is openly encouraged, and various different sort of steps or levels of permissiveness in between. Now, it's perfectly understandable that some organizations are more permissive than others, but if the two were entirely symmetrical, if there was a symmetry between their usage and open source contribution policy, you'd expect to see a neat diagonal line across this diagram. However, what we're seeing is a clustering above and to the left-hand side of the line. What this indicates is that there are a number of organizations where the usage policies tend to be more permissive than contribution. And again, this is the asymmetry. This is the imbalance that we're highlighting within the report. This is what results in a situation where there are significantly fewer makers than there are takers of open source. And this imbalance, it has caused and is starting to cause various issues within the open source community, the various sustainability issues. Another thing to point out is when we focus on the contribution policy, we start to see significant differences based on the size of the organization. So this is, again, the level of permissiveness of their contribution policy on your vertical axis and the size of the organization running horizontally. So on your left-hand side, it's sort of micro organizations. On the right-hand side, it's your megacorps. And as you can see, as organizations get larger, the contribution policies become less permissive. Also, what I find quite interesting here is there's a significant number, regardless of the size of the organization, where there is no clear policy. For almost every organization, 25% of them don't appear to have any clear policy on contribution. And what happens when there isn't a policy is it just doesn't happen. And I think that's an immediate opportunity to address that. Another thing we observed is there's a bit of a strange paradox in the relationship between open source and security. And as I mentioned, security is becoming a growing concern, and this is quite closely coupled to the maintenance challenge of open source and the asymmetry between use and contribution, the taker and maker imbalance. We're in a situation where software is becoming more complex and more componentized. So when I first started working in software sort of 20 years ago, architecture diagrams had like 3 or 4 rectangles on them and a few lines. Architecture diagrams now, using cloud services, have tens or hundreds of boxes on them and lots of lines. And then when you look at each individual box, you might be using a JavaScript framework that's got 1,000 dependencies. So at every level that you look at on your software architecture, things seem to have got more complicated. We are using a lot more third-party components in the build of our applications. And there have been various new breeds of attack, supply chain attacks, for example. You've probably heard of things like Log4Shell, Heartbleed. You may not have heard of things like dependency confusion and typo squatting. There are an ever-growing number of attacks, and open source is one of the targets, a clear target for a lot of these attacks. So we asked about the actions people undertake before incorporating a new open source component into their supply chain. So what checks do they do before picking up something from GitHub and incorporating it into their code, bringing it into their organization, potentially, bringing it into their clients' organizations? And interestingly, the most often cited check is we check the activity level of the project and the community, which isn't a terribly sophisticated type of check. The next most often cited check is we check the ratings or the package download statistics. Some of the more sophisticated checks, things like source code fuzzing, responsible disclosure policy, security, don't seem to be undertaken so often. 1 in 5 respondents didn't have any type of risk management approach in place, no internal checks, formal review processes at all. And again, considering that that earlier people indicated that open source doesn't necessarily improve security, it would seem that their processes are somewhat lax based on that knowledge. Another interesting observation is the public sector is not seeing the growing value perceived by others. And this is sort of reminiscent of some of the results that we saw last year. When we ran this survey, public sector was often an outlier across multiple results, and an outlier, unfortunately, not in a terribly good way. And funnily enough, results this year have shown a pretty similar picture. So again, if we look at the perceived change in value derived from open source over the last year, and we split by public sector and other industries, you can immediately see this mismatch. Only 37% in public sector consider that they are seeing a growth in value derived from open source, whereas 59% of other sectors are expressing a growth in value. Last year, we also found that public sector organizations were very much at the forefront in terms of organizations lacking clear policies for use and consumption. And I personally found this a little bit of an odd mismatch, because within the UK, within Europe, a lot of countries have legislation and policies around the use of open source by public sector organizations, that they are mandated that they either use open source or that there is a consideration of open source within procurement. However, when you speak to the people on the ground, the people that are actually, writing the code, procuring the software, they are pointing to a lack of policy. So I think the lack of, they have a high level policy intent and a legal framework that's not translated into a usable policy by those that are actually making the decisions on the ground. And also another thing that we really have to be mindful here, rather than just pointing the finger at public sector, is their wants and their needs tend to be quite different from those within the private sector. Within the private sector, there's a strong sentiment towards the use of open source for standards, for digital commons, for example, whereas within the public sector, better academic education, government adoption of open source, these are the areas that they want to see investment. There's a mismatch. One of the things that I find quite interesting is most of the conversation about open source tends to be within organizations like Linux foundations and others. And if you look at the membership of those organizations, almost every member is a private sector organization. When we shared these findings at Bilbao Linux Foundation Summit Europe, which is a conference that's open to anyone, private, public sector, academic, I asked people to raise their hands and say who works for a public sector organization, and in a room of about 150 people, only 3 hands went up. So we clearly haven't created the forum and the space for people working within public sector to discuss their specific challenges with respect to open source. So what's next? I'm going to do the usual. I should have put a QR code on this or something. You're going to have to Google it. But please do take a look at the report, download it, read it. If you've got anything specific that you'd like to ask as a question, please do. So that's it for my very much whistle-stop tour of the report finding.
And now I'm going to pass over to Ciarán. So Ciarán O'Riordan comes from Open Forum Europe, but originally from Ireland, even though you're now, over in Brussels. But Ciarán is going to share with us some information about what's been happening around the Cyber Resilience Act and some of the potential impact that has on the open source community. So just as an indication, how many people have kind of heard of the Cyber Resilience Act and the implications on the open source community? Kind of wave, we kind of, do you know about it? So we do have some people who don't know anything at all, Ciarán. So it'd be a good idea to maybe give some background about the context of where this came from and not only the issues, but where it is at the moment and where it's going. But look, I'll leave it to you. Hand it over to you, Ciarán.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so the first minute and a half of my presentation isn't exactly in chronological order, but bear with me for this. So in September 2022, the European Commission published their proposal for this Cyber Resilience Act. And we didn't really look at it all that closely because it was a liability file. And we take patents and copyrights very seriously, and then they started talking about interoperability for a few years, and we took that seriously, and then platforms and data and AI. Liability, it was just, it was item number 11, and really we've only got time for so many things. So that wasn't the first time we'd seen the topic, though, because I work for Open Forum Europe, and we did submit something when the European Commission had a consultation in April of 2022. So they had published something and said to say, we're thinking of doing something on this topic, and we put in a submission saying, be careful about free and open source software, and and then thought a little more of it. I got back to work. So in December then was really when we actually read the text, and we're very surprised, let's say, and a little bit confused by how somebody could put this idea down on paper. So then I have to jump out of that timeline to explain what Open Forum Europe is. So for us in Open Forum Europe, we review this as a failure. We work on policy, the implementation or advocacy side, for in particular trying to get free software into public administrations. We work on policy on the legislative side, which is what we're doing on the Cyber Resilience Act right now. But we work on the relationship building and the education to prevent these things from happening in the first place. So for us, once there is a piece of legislation that is this surprising, that's already, how come we didn't stop this 3 years ago? So that's our own self-critical view, at least, of our role. But luckily we had submitted something, and it did have an influence in when they published the Cyber Resilience Act, which I'll get into why it's so problematic a little later. But there was one nice paragraph, and it said that this does not apply to non-commercial free and open source software because it helps innovation and one or two other conditions. And so we saw that paragraph, and we didn't exactly like it because non-commercial, we never know what that means, and of course we need businesses to have a healthy ecosystem. So anything that punishes businesses ends up punishing everyone as well, in this situation at least. So we weren't delighted with this paragraph, but at least we had something then that we can work on amending. But it did set off a little bell, and it got us thinking. All these studies have shown that 75 or 90% of software nowadays is free and open source software. How come we're getting this big text about software and then there's one paragraph about free and open source software? Why don't we have a big long text about free and open source software and then one paragraph saying, well, if you insist on keeping your software source code private, then you also have this? But that's a separate thing that we'll work on in the coming years. So we looked at the text, and we thought this was a completely unworkable idea. The text said that if you distribute software, I'm paraphrasing here, but if you distribute software, you have to promise to give 5 years of security updates. You have to be available on 24 hours notice to respond to security issues. You have to certify that it has no exploitable security vulnerabilities, which is nice. You have to produce a bunch of documentation, possibly in other languages. That wasn't clear. So we looked at this, and we just thought this was absolutely unworkable, which in a way seemed like a good thing, because we thought, well, everyone is going to hate this text, so we'll just gather together all the people who realize that this will never work, and we'll make a big coalition, and we'll get this thing fixed. So we then went and spoke to some of our usual allies, the SMEs and consumer groups and digital rights groups, and were surprised to learn that they liked this idea of a CRA, because for them, when they read it, it was like, oh, free cybersecurity will fall from the sky, and we all get to benefit, and we don't have to pay anything. This is fantastic. And so at this point, we realized that there was work to be done, not only to change the legislation, but we also had to do the meta work of explaining to all the other social actors why they should care, and remind them that actually their small businesses run and are able to be competitive because our software exists, and digital rights are greatly benefited by the existence of our software, and consumers benefit. And so we had to also do this. So we actually ended up having more work to do than we expected to. So we decided we'll build this coalition. We finally did. It was a second difficulty in building the coalition was that because this was a liability topic, and we hadn't really worked on liability before, it was difficult when we went to groups and said, well, who's your liability person? We'd like to add them to a mailing list, and nobody has a liability person. People have a patents person and a copyright person and a trademarks person. Nobody has, especially in small and medium-sized projects, there is no liability person. So it was difficult to find these people. But eventually we did. We built a coalition, and it's gotten quite large now. It's Eclipse Foundation and Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation, Free Software Foundation, Red Hat, GitHub, Python. Then we've got all the national SME Alliance. There's OSPA in Germany, and there's a lot of great organizations in Italy and France. And so we got all these people to talk together and to contribute to the work, and that is one of the successes, at least, of our work on the CRA, is that we've managed to get this big group. So the issues then, if what's at stake, like if we manage to fix this or don't. So what could happen if we don't manage to fix this? One of the main things is that the idea of distributing software is not very clear. Do you mean a software package, or do you mean any piece of software? Does that include a patch? So if it includes a patch, then the question is, well, if I submit my patch upstream, have I just placed my software on the market? And if I'm doing this during my working hours, is this in a commercial context? And so this means that all of a sudden, all the people who would contribute, particularly the small amounts, they will have to think before they can just fix a bug, add a feature, and send it upstream. They'll then have to think, well, actually, does this have a Cyber Resilience Act obligation tied to it? And they might have to talk to their boss and say, can I get authorization for this? And then the boss is going to say, well, what's in it for us? And if it's a small feature, a little patch, why would somebody authorize taking on all this cyber resilience liability just so that you can benefit upstream? So it really puts sand in the works of our model, which relies on having really low barriers to entry. So from the developer side, they could be concerned about upstreaming their work. And then from the upstream projects, they could be concerned about accepting third-party code, because if you have to distribute and if you have to be responsible for the package that you distribute, well, it's one thing being responsible for what your employees put into the package, but it's quite a different thing if you're getting code from multiple groups around the internet, and then you have to then say this package has 0 known exploitable vulnerabilities. So from both ends, then it makes it very difficult to collaborate, and this is how we make good software teams. So that's the collaboration issue is one. The commercial issue also kind of throws sand in the works in a similar way by making people worried about accepting donations, prizes, payment. So if somebody had worked on a piece of software and then a bug bounty was offered for this, then they'd have to think, well, does that put me in a commercial context, and am I going to have CRA obligations because I've now gotten a prize for fixing this bug? So it kind of spoils the community approach in that sense. And then on the larger scale, I think the one possible result would be that simply there would be less software distributed within the EU, and people would, instead of distributing actual software, they would move to a much more online services model. And if this happens, a lot of the time it's going to be online services that are from the outside the EU, from one country in particular. So this would mean then that we, instead of financing our local businesses, we're sending money across to finance the US IT industry. And then from perspective of free and open source software, we are no longer using neither free software nor proprietary software, but actually hosted services, which we no longer even have a binary on a computer. We have the least control possible over our computing at that stage. So this would be a bad thing for us, and generally a bad thing for the European software industry and for the digital sovereignty of the European Union. So with all these problems, and the next thing we have to think of is, at the base, where did all this come from? How did a text get written that is so detached from modern software development practices? So we think there's probably 3 things that went on. First off, the text was designed with physical products in mind, and then the word software was inserted quite liberally, but the mentality there is that there is some kind of connection between hardware and this obligation. The second mistake we think that happened is that we think that the drafters were imagining a proprietary software model where you have a very simple supply chain. You have a single company who is developing software, and then when they think the time is right, they will make a release and they will distribute on a one-to-one relationship with the user. I think even in the proprietary software world, this is an outdated model, but we're talking about an old model, and this is what would correspond to what would actually kind of work with the Cyber Resilience Act. Because in that situation, you have control over at what point will you make a release, and you have control over the number of releases. So if each release requires a certain amount of compliance work, you can decide, okay, we'll do 10 releases this year. We won't do nightly builds. So this idea of a single supplier of the software seems to be one idea that caused it to be written the way it is. And then the other issue is also, from a proprietary point of view, there seems to be an idea that we can put all these obligations on the supplier because the supplier knows the software best. And here the assumption is that the supplier is the developer. And of course, for proprietary software, that is often the case, or was often the case 10, 20 years ago. For free and open source software, this is almost never the case. So there's very few software companies who will develop the entire package themselves and then sell that package and nothing but that package. So this is another thing that we looked at internally, as this is part of the educational work that we try and do on an ongoing basis. And we have a certain amount of success. There are people in the European Commission, in the Council, in the Parliament who understand these things, but there's also a certain churn. And so we're constantly working to try and increase the number of people who are educated on these topics. But also, we're losing them every 5 years. And so it's something, if possible, we'd like to increase the amount of work we do on it, but we also have to work within the resources that we have. So that is that's more or less the background to the Cyber Resilience Act. The current situation is that we have been listened to quite a lot by the policymakers. They are working on new proposals which still don't really match how we develop software. We do think that there is a good chance that the final version will be much better than the original proposal, but it still could go either way. One of the things that made this file a little bit more complicated than most is that with the elections coming up next June, the people in the Parliament, they need to get everything finished before the elections, and in some cases they want to get things finished before January so they can work on re-election campaigns rather than finishing legislation, which means that the timeline for this is quite compressed. There are a lot of issues that we've noticed would need kind of fundamental education, but there's no time for that. And so we're now technically in the final stage of the legislative procedure. This is the trilogues where the Commission, Parliament and Council all get together in a room and work on a solution. However, usually at this stage the legislation would be quite finished, but because everything happened so quickly, we've now ended up in this stage according to the procedure, but there are still a lot of discussions taking place. So things are still quite flexible, but at the same time, anything that gets written during the trilogues, we always get a bit nervous about it because we can educate the policymakers as much as possible before they go into the room, but then they go into a room and close the door, and we have to hope that what we've explained has been understood and that they don't mix two solutions together and end up with something that doesn't work at all. So in that sense, we've got a lot of work in the next 2 months, definitely on Cyber Resilience Act. That's more or less the background on the status. I was going to leave the legislative part there. I noticed I'm already close to time. I was going to just mention a few meta things that we've noticed during this work. We've worked, the work has been really it's this type of coalition really only forms every 3 to 5 years for a big project, and so it's been quite useful for just spotting what works. And so a few things we learned. First off, the coalition building is extremely important. That it is quite difficult and needs to be nurtured, and the value of it has to be acknowledged and of all the members. A second one is discussion fatigue. We've noticed that we have to be quite disciplined in for how long we will discuss a certain topic, because we don't want to get into a situation where the people feel a need to stay in a discussion for longer than a day, because otherwise their point will no longer be defended. And then so this sort of thing. And then also we have to make sure that the same topics don't get brought up again without having been worked on in the meantime, because this once again makes people feel that that they're just, if they miss a meeting, then a certain topic a certain decision will be taken simply by it being raised repeatedly. For meetings, very important, probably for a lot of things, but for maybe particularly for this work, just because we have a coalition of people from completely unrelated organizations. We have the associations, we have businesses, we have lawyers, we have all different categories, and so we found it's very important to have an agenda before the meeting, stick as closely as possible to the agenda, and respect the finishing time of the meeting. There's a lot of people with firmly held beliefs. That's probably not a big surprise in this ecosystem, and we've just found that that's something we have to live with, and we have to find ways to make sure that people can defend their firmly held beliefs within the group without it being a tug of war or an arm wrestle, and that's just another skill that takes a bit of exercising. We have to be careful about our communications. We made a mistake in the start of the CRA. We focused on the non-commercial or the development end, and so we said, to show our goodwill, we said, look, we accept that there will be CRA on the commercial supply, but it's really important to shield the development. And as the months went by, we realized that actually the commercial supply phase is actually really bad for us as well, because for proprietary software, they distribute once and they have a single CRA compliance procedure. For us, we might have 10, we might have 40 companies who are modifying and redistributing the software commercially. So our software is actually getting redistributed, run through the compliance procedure 10 or 40 times. So in hindsight, saying that we accept there will be procedures in the commercial supply was we were selling ourselves out by saying that. So it's just care has to be taken in communication. In building coalitions, we have a lot of different type of people. Some of them are difficult to get along with. Some of them are very easy to get along with. In general, we found that everyone is useful. Everyone has it's an invite-only group. People get invited because we expect they will have a certain useful experience, and we've always found that we're happily. This is confirmed. The only thing that's difficult to work with is the person who arrives the day before the vote and says, "Can I see the documents? What can I do?" Very difficult. And so I realized, after seeing this type of person arrive every now and again, I realized the analogy is like a software project. If I came along to your software project and said, "I really wish it was faster. What can I do?" And if I wasn't even a programmer, this is something that people should understand. The work on policy is a job in itself, and unfortunately, walking in off the street and just rolling up your sleeves doesn't help as much as it would in certain other domains. And the last thing is the meta goal. So our goal on this, our main goal is to work on the Cyber Resilience Act to fix this, so we don't have pain in the face at the end of the whole thing. The meta goal, though, has to be that we're all still working together in 2 months' time and we haven't fallen out. And then the real meta goal is that once the CRA is finished, that this group of people will still be on good terms and will be able to work together, and will also find it pleasant enough pleasant enough to work together, such that they will continue working together on policy files, because the bad news is they're not going away. We have the Product Liability Directive, the Standard Essential Patents Regulation, the AI Act, the AI Liability Directive, the Data Act, the DMA, the DSA, and we have AI legislation popping up all around the world. The USA is talking about a Cyber Resilience Act. I can never remember, it might be CISA, and the UK is working on one, and this is not going to disappear. And so with that, I hope that I have sold the idea of working on policy, and that everyone is raring to go, and I'll see everyone popping up on policy discussions.
Well, Kieran, thank you so much for that overview. But I think one of the questions that came up in chat is I think the burning question. I mean, it does sound like there are considerable issues, and it sounds also that you have a coalition of folks willing to outline those considerable issues. And I know some of them are big companies and global companies. I know some of them are big European companies, small European companies. There's a huge mix of people all saying this is not going to work. And I know that there are various different calls for what will happen, and, chicken lick in the sky will fall down and all the rest of it. But I mean, what are the chances of it not passing? I mean, is this a case of our best chance is to tweak it because there's no stopping this juggernaut? Or is there any chance of people kind of going, hold on a minute now, the sky really will fall down and we really need to think twice about passing this? From your experience in terms of European legislation.
I think this will pass, because the European Commission published a work programme a week ago, and it was a 16-page document. It only mentioned about 10 different policy files, for the whole European Union. So this is covering pharmaceuticals and social policy and all these different things. And Cyber Resilience Act was one of the 10 that it mentioned. So it sounds like this is a big priority for the European Commission. So I'm not betting on this one falling between the cracks. It can happen. Maybe some of the other ones that I mentioned might fall between the cracks. Or if things like anything that's supposed to finish by the end of November, if that slides by 2 weeks, then all of a sudden it's Christmas. Then all of a sudden in the start of January you have a new parliament, new president of the council. You then end up being stuck with delays for possibly the translators. I know are absolutely drowned at the moment with work. So there are some dynamics that could cause things to drop, but I think the Commission has made a real priority of the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, it could get greatly reduced. That would be a fantastic outcome. They might decide, we have to push this through. Let's remove all the controversial stuff. That's possible. But for the moment, we're not that we're assuming the worst, but we don't. We're definitely not assuming that things will just happen easily.
Okay, and so then, at the risk of being the person who turns up at the last minute saying, what can I do to help? What can folks who have not been involved in the process do to help? Is there anything, or is that just a useless question to ask? I mean, do we just leave it in your capable hands? Or, I mean, I'm knowing the size of the challenge ahead of you, but for folks on the call and for, people who are just part of the open source community looking to maybe make this a little bit better, what can be done?
Yeah, it's so it's a bit hit and miss, and it's not the case, unfortunately, that everyone can do something. You can't take a day and dedicate it to this topic and necessarily get an achievement. But by talking to a lot of people about this, we do find somebody who happens to be the friend of somebody who knows somebody who works in the office of the ministry that's working on this, or people within a company who we mightn't contact because we wouldn't think that they'd be interested, or we might think that they would have the opposite position. And sometimes people contact us then and say, well, actually, for us, we use a bit of free and open source software, and it doesn't cost us anything to get involved. So we're happy to. So sometimes we get support from very big companies simply because they don't have a dog in the race, and then they just, it'd be a little bit good for us if the CRA was improved. Therefore, we're happy to put our name or share our contact list. So that's one thing. If people can think of who they know and who is known by the people they know, that kind of thing. There's another knock-on effect of the Parliament and the entire EU institutions being so busy and having a tight timeline is that we don't have the old situation of all the MEPs working on particular files. So like with the Software Patents Directive 20 years ago now, in Strasbourg is a huge, it's two huge buildings with a bridge, a sky bridge between them, and so the people who were pushing for software patents, they rented a yacht and they paid somebody to drive up and down in a yacht with a big Patents for Innovation flag on it, and so we got some kayaks, and some of our people got into kayaks and rowed up beside the yacht, and we had a big, software patents kill innovation, or whatever the slogan we had on our, and so I think that was nice, because I hope, like, how did the kayak keep up with the yacht? And the answer was, well, the guy who was driving the yacht didn't care. He was just paid to drive a yacht. So when a kayak came up beside him, he just kept driving at the same speed. We actually had our people in the kayaks, and so that type of lobbying. And I met one of those guys recently, actually.
Thinking.
But that kind of lobbying, unfortunately, it doesn't have as much of an impact anymore. The protests outside the parliament, that sort of thing. Legislation is being worked on much smaller groups within the parliament, and if we contact people who aren't working directly on a file, and there's usually 6 or 7 working directly on each file, if you contact people outside that group, they'll often tell you, go and talk to my person who's on this file. So yeah, it can be difficult. If people are interested, get in touch with. Well, one thing, if you think there's somebody who might help out, somebody who has a friend in a political party, or has a friend who's got a good position in a company, who might be able to get support from them, or if you're involved in any of the local user groups and any community organizations, it's always useful to talk to these people, to see if they have ideas for what to do, to send letters to national governments, to possibly point them in the direction of, like, if there's a good letter online by Linux Foundation, or by Eclipse, or by these other organizations. Open Forum Europe has almost nothing online. That's a certain style that we have, but there are plenty of other organizations that have written good letters on the Cyber Resilience site. So, rather than writing something yourself, one of the easiest ways is to identify a person who might have some impact, identify a good letter, and send that letter to the person without having to write anything yourself, and just endorse something that already is out there.
Okay, so I'm going to take from this, in an almost continuation of us Europeans being so romantic, that we should leverage our networks and relationships. Obviously, we're good at that sort of thing, and really kind of try and use that to get some impact happening. So thank you for that. And now also keeping in mind Kieran's point about making sure that we do finish as advertised on time, so we don't frustrate anyone. And I know some people have had to drop off, but I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that, Kieran. Thank you for the great work that you're doing in Open Forum Europe on this issue, and thanks everyone else for coming along today to hear about both the European trends and indeed this particularly very important issue that's going to, I think, impact all of us here in Europe. I think everyone everywhere, though, because I mean, it actually, regardless of what happens, it's actually going to cause an impact for everyone else in the world as well. So this is a big one. So the more people that know about it and can think about ways in which we can influence it, the better. So thank you so much for that, Kieran. Just to finish up by saying that we're now starting these regular series of community calls for Open Ireland Network. So we have a couple of ideas and suggestions for particular focus areas around particular vertical industries and particular topics that people have actually put forward for potentially going over the next few months. But if anyone has particular areas where they would like to highlight great open source work, use, or contribution to open source community in Ireland, or in fact, if they're interested in something that's happening in the global ecosystem that they think the folks in Ireland should know more about, then please do let us know. You can contact me directly at claire.dillon@live.ie, or in fact info@openirelandnetwork.com, either way, or put it in our LinkedIn group, or there'll be many ways you can actually think to pass it on, but please do feel free to share any suggestions you have about future community calls. And in the meantime, we'll be in touch to let you know about what's happening in November in the next little while. But thank you all so much for coming along today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. So in the meantime, have a very nice Wednesday. And thank you again, Kieran, and thank you, Colin, who had to drop off. Hopefully we'll see you all.
Thanks, Claire, for all your great work as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye now.